Welcome everyone, and we're really delighted to see such large numbers of participants joining us for this second in a new 2025 series of LDnet webinars. So in our first webinar, we looked at how the understanding of local development has changed over time from the original Einstein ladder to co-everything. And you can find that recording to that on our website, and we'll put the link in the chat in a few minutes. So today's webinar is a really timely look at the cycle of EU funding and its potential impact on local development. So a week ago, the European Commission published a communication on the road to the next multi-annual financial framework, which is due to start in 2028. Policy making, though, and the funds that follow it is never a straight line. But as we have seen recently, policies do have significant impacts on people's lives, and the current geopolitical situation means there are far too many examples to mention. So in addition, the expectation is that this time the changes are expected to be much bigger than in previous policy cycles. So this makes it all the more important to take into account experts and stakeholders' views. Now we in our association LDnet, paraphrasing from our mission statement, we aim to spread knowledge and expertise to enable sustainable local development approaches at all levels of governance. We aim to be a bridge between experts, activists and policymakers, mainly in the EU member states, but across all types of territory and across a wide range of themes, ranging from social inclusion, job creation, and local economic development, to concerns about climate change, the circular economy, bioeconomy, and digital transitions. In other words, we aim to enable the development and sharing of information and knowledge among all those active in local development to promote social cohesion and resilience. So it is within this in mind that we host this webinar to highlight in our own small way the important role of stakeholders in this particular policy cycle and to support and encourage action to participate in shaping the Europe that we want to see in the future. So what are the potential implications for local development in rural and urban areas in Europe? That's the question for today. So to address this question, we'll have three short presentations from three policy experts who I will introduce shortly. We'll follow this with a time for discussion, and then you are warmly invited to stay on for our General Assembly. The slides and recordings, of course, will be available on our website shortly after. So to move on to introduce our policy experts, we have Ursula, who's an expert in local development in rural and fisheries areas with over 30 years of experience in programme and project management, capacity building, networking analysis, and evaluation at national and EU levels. She has been the director of the Rural Development Bureau in her native Poland, managing EU projects, funded projects and programmes before taking on the role as the senior local development expert in LDnet. Then she moved on to be a key expert in charge of LEADER at the contact point of the European Network for Rural Development. And since December 2022, she's been the senior policy analyst in the Rural PAC Support Office. And she's also vice president of LDnet and a board member of the Polish Rural Forum. Serafin has also had a very varied career in the Basque government as a representative for several regions in Brussels, the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, the East of England region, and his native Galicia. And as a policy practitioner and academic researcher in multi-level governance, subsidiarity, EU cohesion policy, rural development, and comparative decentralisation processes. He has chaired the Cohesion Expert Group of the Council of European Municipalities and Regions over 2 EU programming periods and was its representative in the European Network on Rural Development and DG Regio Partnership Expert Group. Serafin has also acted as expert in different capacities, particularly covering depopulation and rural proofing in various European level communities. He's a member of various academic networks such as the Regional Studies Association, the Spanish Political Science Association, and he's also the senior expert in rural and territorial development in ADL, with the responsibility for a range of Horizon projects. Last but not least is Stefan. And since 2008, Stefan has been a researcher at the European Policies Research Centre in Glasgow. And his main expertise lies with EU cohesion policy, especially its territorial dimension, both rural and urban contexts. And he has recently been involved in the evaluation of territorial instruments that were funded by EU cohesion policy. He also works in an EU project piloting territorial instruments in Serbia, and he's a board member of LDnet. So we have some great experience. And with that in mind, I'm going to hand over first to Ursula, and she will start the presentations from our policy experts. Over to you, Ursula.
Many thanks, Joanna. I don't know, Joanna, if you have actually introduced yourself, but Joanna, you are...
No!
You are also one of our experts, and maybe I'll let you say a couple of words just to complete the picture.
I always do that. I always do that. So yes, I'm a researcher at the Estonian University of Life Sciences, and my particular interests are on rural local development, and this is why I've got involved in LDnet, because it's such a wealth of resources regarding local development. So, and I'm now the treasurer of LDnet. So
okay, thanks a lot. Okay, so this is just a very, very brief introduction concerning what's in store, what is actually going to happen in the next weeks, months, and years. And then I will come back again, maybe to present the rural angle at the very end of the role of speakers. But just, let's say, we are interested in local development, and local development can go across different types of areas, and it can be funded from different sources. We are all familiar with the leader approach. So in the Common Agriculture Policy, of course, the CAP, we have leader approach which is acting on rural areas primarily. And then you have cohesion policy, the CP. I'm sorry about the acronyms, but it was just an issue of trying to squeeze too much information into graphics. So the cohesion policy, which is in yellow, and the common agriculture policy, which is in green, can operate in different types of EU areas with community-led local development. And that goes for coastal areas, rural areas, and urban areas in different proportions, varying proportions between countries. But also the cohesion policy has also another tool which is also territorial, which can also have a local angle, which is called Integrated Territorial Investment, or ITI. And that normally operates in urban areas and occasionally in non-urban areas, but it's not specified whether these non-urban areas are rural or coastal or whatever. And then there are all kinds of national funding sources which operate in different types of areas, and for which very little is actually known how much money is going. But we know that local areas across Europe are benefiting from all these different sources in different combinations. And this is the situation today. Now we know, as Joanna has mentioned, it's likely to change. How is it going to change? We're going to discuss that. But we have to say, we don't know yet much, and we have a time frame where these different proposals of the policies which will happen after 2027 will become reality. And for comparison, we have brought this picture of how the policies were developed and discussed and consulted and finally adopted in the current program period. We are currently in the period 2021 to 27. That's 7-year framework, multi-annual financial framework of the European funding. And as you can see, the first proposals were drafted in May 2018. Then there was a whole series of consultations and discussions. There was a very, very long discussion within the European Council. The reason was partly because of COVID and different other, let's say, crises. But you can see that in the end, the adoption of the multi-annual financial framework happened literally on the threshold of the period itself, so in December 2020. So it is a good 2.5 years, the whole process. Now, what we can say about post-2020, so the next period, sorry, I have gone too fast. I meant to say this was after 2027. We are in 2025. In June or July, or maybe September, it's not clear, the Commission will put forward the proposals, the concrete proposals for the multi-annual financial frameworks, and then for the different regulations, the common regulations and the fund-specific regulations. Then we still have to go through the whole process of citizen consultation, agreements within the Council, with the European Parliament, before it can be adopted. So we have a long way before us. We have no way how long it will take and what will happen in between. But it is the time now to try and imagine how this process will happen and how much we can still influence what is already decided. Thank you very much. And then I hand over to Serafin, probably.
Thank you, Ursula. Thank you very much. I will be neatly transition to my bit, but just to reflect quickly on what Ursula mentioned. I mean, things are accelerating, and what the day-to-day has been. Because last week we had the proposal, as Joanna mentioned. Now we have a bit more clarity on the calendar. Probably the consultation, well, the consultation has been, initial consultation has been launched. It's not clear whether going to be additional consultation in the autumn, but definitely one for the whole MFF. It's going to be tabled, I can anticipate, on the 20th of July. Why the 20th of July? Because it is the day before all civil servants go on holiday. So I bet you, what's that space? It's going to be the 20th of July, 21st Belgian National Day. We all leave Brussels. We celebrate Belgian National Day by leaving the country. So, but what the day has it been today? Because in addition to reflect on that, we have earlier today the debate in the European Parliament tabling of the nature report on the cohesion policy in rural areas. We got later the vision for agricultural food, which has a significant part on local development beyond farming. More than expected, actually. We have later a discussion with the German government and the Commission, the region, others on urban policy. Then to be followed by the first opinion for the new mandate of the Committee of the Region started today. And the first thing they do is voting on a new position on the future of CLLD leader post-2027. And just to top it up, this incredible meeting, LDnet meeting. So thank you very much for the invitation. Of course, I have to say I will speak in a personal capacity, but however, that cannot, what I'm going to say is not clouded, it's obviously clouded by what we've been hearing today, the policy statement that ADL has approved last year on these topics, as well as the various Horizon projects that, as you know, I'm responsible for policy development together with my team. Just going to be quickly straight to the issue at hand. Hope you see my screen as always. Just to say that I'm going to basically try to bring a bit of challenges, some of the things you probably are aware of, some maybe less so. And I'm going to be a bit of a perspective, and then Stefan and Ursula will do a bit of more granular approach. So let me lay out the big picture for you. So we're in 2025, but history changed in 2020, not just because of COVID, but because the EU budget structure as we know it drastically changed. The Gordian knot of financing the budget with debt was broken forever, for the first time in a big way. There has been precedents on that previously, but this was now one big way. Next Generation EU almost doubled the size of the MFF, and the Recovery and Resilience Facility, RRF, is like a new structural fund, actually a new cohesion fund, which is almost double the size of the cohesion fund. You can see there the proportions. In red is cohesion policy as we know it, including rural development. And then in yellow is this big circle of recovery facilities, like Jupiter compared to Earth, if you put it in the size of the planets. I said in the slides, double RRF is like a new cohesion fund, and this is not an accidental. Many member states love to have, particularly those who already had the cohesion fund, which is a fund for countries as a national fund for cohesion, but managed by the central government for big projects. They all wanted to have that. Those who lost it, like Spain, as you know, as I'm Spanish, try to recreate it through ERDF. So, they have, but now all member states will have their own cohesion fund doing more or less the same things as cohesion policy. It was a boom for many. Then we had the issue of finance not linked to costs, which is this methodology that already existed in the United Nations programs, World Bank. It exists to a certain extent in some EU programs. This was generalized, and that's a complete revolution the way financial management work in cohesion compared to cohesion policy. The problem, as we will see, is that it's finance not linked to cost and sometimes not linked to anything. And that is the problem as highlighted by the Court of Auditors and many others, including yours truly in a number of things already in 2020, that will be a lot of risks on this issue. Then there was this issue of payment for reforms, which was an interesting change. And for the first time, compared to the ex-ante conditionalities and other conditionalities cohesion policy had linked to the European semester, it really provides significant change. The problem is that sometimes, as we will see, semester sometimes a bit not territorially enough to actually capture the needs of territories. Still, payment by milestone, which milestones that so you basically you get paid as you are progressing to delivering a particular goal, is something that existed in cohesion policy in the past. But this was basically generalized in the recovery resilience facility. It's not just an option, it's the way you do it. The problem with that is that the milestones, and I'm speaking mostly through the Spanish program, which is this biggest, second biggest recovery resilience facility program in the EU, so it's a good example, I think. Milestones can be inputs, can be outputs, can be outcomes. And that is the problem with the milestone as currently designed the recovery resilience facility. Then we have, in theory, the recovery facility was, Next Generation EU was of direct management. That is not true, actually. In practice, has been hardly direct management. The Commission agreed the big figures. There was a much more political element of getting things that in the past, less technocratic, if you want, faster as well, of course. But a lot of the responsibility lies far more in the member states than in the case of cohesion policy. So more than direct management from the EU, is like a lot of management transfer and only that dealt with at national level. That is the other element, as you know, recovery facilities are de facto centralization of territorial policies. Many member states, like the health ministries, never dealt with a lot of EU funds, and now a new constituency has been created. Suddenly, there's many ministries who would like to actually get a bit of the pie of EU funds post-2027 because they, for the first time, got significantly financed by Next Generation EU. There's no partnership principle, only consultation. So basically, we go back to almost 25 years to the sort of governance that existed in the funds compared to cohesion policy. Territorial development is a byproduct. So if you are in Spain with a political situation that forces you to regionalize half of the recovery facility, you have a fairly territorialized recovery resilience facility. If you are Austria and Germany, despite of being a federal states, actually is far more centralized than cohesion policy. So it's a byproduct depending on local circumstances and not by design. Of course, as I'm going to quickly go over, the 2025 proposals that are now being presented initially are based on this massive shift that I just explained. So to help you navigate that, if I manage to get my, yes. Some of you, all hands on policy making European level, you probably have seen these graphs or something like it. This is a simplified version of what it has been confirmed last week that the Commission is working on. Not necessarily exactly like this, what you are seeing, but this is give you a visual identity of what you're going to have in storage. It's going to be a single plan for each member state, putting together CAP strategic plans, ERDF plans, cohesion plans, European social plans, operational programs, and so on. The Commission has been insisting, and I was number of things in the Committee of the Regions with them on this, that there's 530 programs for member states. Of course, that includes also regional programs because there are many regions in Europe. And that's a lot of things to manage for member states, but also at regional level, there is a regional development plan, a rural development plan, a European ESF program. So there are far too many programs and far too little cooperation between ministries at central local level or central regional level, but also in between ministries or regional departments of the same government. So having something streamlined linked to reforms can be a positive thing. Also because there is, on the one hand, cohesion policy or the capital strategic plans, but then there is the social climate plans, there is the European semester, national energy climate plans, and many other plans that member states are meant to deliver, and sometimes they are completely not linked with the source of financing, notably cohesion policy and CAP. So having something to put together, this is behind what the Commission is looking at. So in principle, it's not a bad thing if done correctly. We'll get to that in a second. Of course, the other element, the other half of the budget will be this European Competitiveness Fund that you have heard about. This is for centrally managed or directly managed programs, essentially merging together all the existing programs, including Horizon, that you know about, and probably going to be much bigger in size than the individual funds are at the moment in the current budget. What is the advantage of that? Well, that the Commission, if there's a new crisis, and we have seen a fair amount of that, rather than having to tinker with cohesion policy, we can just first go through these centrally managed programs and tinker around them to create a new facility, which will provide more flexibility. What is the risk? The risk is that because it's a legal point. If the funds are not independent funds, the Commission will have perhaps a lot of discretion, and some people will say, particularly from the European Parliament, far too much discretion to make changes without really consulting. So there's a fine balance to do in terms of having a big bazooka at European level they can directly do without having to deal with renegotiating national or regional operational programs, but there are some issues already dealing with that. And I'll conclude already, because I'm always speak too much, with some reflections. If you look at this funny little childish graph in the corner of your screen, this is a 2009 graph from my English local government colleagues who already were calling for an integration and bonfire of initiatives and merging them into something more consolidated. Well, we are almost 2 decades after, and we're still trying to grapple how to do it. But one reflection I will make, and trying to be controversial because this is the moment to be so, is that reforms work. If you are in Spain, there's been an employment reform, administration reform, adjusted reform, only because there was this thing that if you do make a reform, we give you a lot of money. What is the problem? That a lot of the investments have nothing to do with the reforms they were supposed to be given for. And that is a significant moral hazard issue that must be resolved. The European semester, many people in cohesion policy don't like it, but I think having a proper link with the semester is a good thing, provided that the semester is also regionalized. Having a common strategic framework, which is essentially what the new proposals of the Commission are looking at, is not a bad thing either. Actually, it's not what we had until 2020. But at the same time, there should be integration at regional level. There cannot be a single national plan unless there are single regional plans, because in some countries, the regions has equal powers with central government in many areas, if not more sometimes. There's need to be much more money for institutional reform and capacity building, far more than what we have at the moment, and completely linked with these national and regional plans. The problem as well with merging funds and having much more leeway at national level is that all the earmarks that we know, like the 5% in LEADER, the 8% on sustainable development, might go away out of the window. So that's something that I think will be a loss if that were to happen. As I said at the beginning, and I conclude with that, finance not linked to investments and not linked to outcomes. This model of finance not linked to cost, as we currently have it, is not good enough. But finally, I would say that we should be, as De Michelis, the Deputy Director General, said the other day, we should try to be in this debate bold, we should try to be political, and should try to be resilient. And sometimes we need to be out of the box. One thing we could consider is, do we need co-financing in cohesion policy? I don't think that will be a problem if we don't have it, as since it has been a significant problem in many countries, lacking the money to do the investment and then to be reimbursed. So some of the financial methodologies of recovery facility are not necessarily a bad thing, provided they are done in respect of the institutional, local, and regional provisions and setup of the countries. And a reflection as well that we talk a lot about leader, and I don't think the leader will disappear. It will be too politically sensitive, but I think we should also critically assess what leader has delivered. Has been some movement on that over the last few years, and I think there's a process we need to consider doing. I leave because I don't want to spend, I already surely spend more than my 10 minutes. So I'm not going to speak more, just say that there's more information on this topic, but I leave you with this map. This is the map of the populating regions and municipalities that appear in the 9th cohesion report. And I anticipate that will be big battlefield in the next discussion of the future of local development post-2020. And I leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Serafin. Are we back to Ursula?
No, that's Stefan now, and I think
Stefan.
I'm at the last one.
Okay, right. Stefan.
Yes, hello everyone.
Hello.
Thank you. Yeah, it's good to hear what Serafin said, and you saw how complex everything is and how big changes we might see. And he said though that there maybe leader might not disappear because of political pressures, and the leader is one of the tools, one of a variation of the tools that I want to give you a brief overview of, and I'll try to share to see what future is there for territorial tools. And what have we seen so far, and what can we maybe expect there? It's only, again, also 4 slides. I hope I keep within the time. I want to start with a look back, because that's the only period where we have a good overview, is 2014-20. And that's when these territorial instruments were introduced. And what do we mean by territorial instruments? What we mean is those that are funded by cohesion policy. And this reform in 14-20 included compulsory elements and optional elements. And it's important that there was a new compulsory allocation of funding, of ERDF funding, that had to be basically implemented by the local level, or with involvement of the local level. And this was 5% of ERDF, which is quite substantial at member state level, which is quite substantial funding in most cases. And there were tools that were new, they were optional, that's important. So they were offered to be used, and then some picked this up and some less. However, it resulted in 28.8 billion of EU funding that was implemented through those territorial instruments, and a variety of instruments across the countries, almost 2,000 at various territorial levels and contexts. And you can see on the map here a very diverse take-up of these tools, taking into account there was a compulsory element, so something had to happen, but which tools you would use was left to the member states. And you can see countries with a very dense cluster of colorful dots, and others with vastly empty spaces. Looking at, well, the current period, although I still sometimes refer to it as the future, although we're already halfway through, or more than halfway through the program period, things changed. But some key elements remained. There's still a compulsory element of urban allocation. This increased even from 5 to 8%. The CLLD and ITI mechanisms remained as optional tools that can be used, and a new category was defined, or was offered more specifically, which was this other tools, because it was recognized that there are domestic approaches. It also explains some of the gaps in the earlier maps. Domestic approaches that do similar things as ITIs and CLLD, and it was given the opportunity for member states to use those as long as they were in line with some of the key principles. We don't have a picture yet of what member states, full picture of how this was implemented on the ground. We know how much funding was allocated, so the funding went up. Now we're talking about 40 billion cohesion policy funding that are at least programmed to be channeled through these instruments. If we look then at the 2 optional tools, but those that we call, or we think, I think, are the most interesting territorial instruments, ITIs, We see a broad continuation where countries made use of those, and in many cases we see an expansion. So it seems to have been perceived to be successful, and a number of countries make strong use of them and expanded this, going into new territories, smaller territories, etc. And in the case of CLD, and this is the map you can see here on the right-hand side, is more of a mix. We see countries that newly introduced CLD, like Romania and France, for instance. We have some that continued existing models, maybe expanded those, like in Poland, we have new regions making use of it. But also, we have to admit, there have been cases where it was deemed not to be successful, where it was discontinued, and some of this was more political reason, but you can see the mix presented on the map. What I think is important to note that while the Commission offers these tools and the local level is often enthusiastic or would like to make use of those, it's the middle part in this multi-level system needs to be convinced. It's the member state that decides, and the member states or regions in the member states and in federal systems, for instance, it's the program managers who decide to make use of those. There is, as I said, the compulsory element, but then a lot of it is left to the decisions of the program managers. And there's a factors of factors influencing these, a series of factors. First of all, it's the institutional setup overall. So do we have a very strongly regionalized country? What is the local level autonomy? As I said, there are centralized countries, there are federalized countries. Then is there a decentralization rationale that is attractive to member states? Is there interest in development of tasks to subnational levels? Is it maybe a part of a way of creating regions, creating a level between the local and the national level? As we can see this in some of the countries that don't have regional levels. Then the wider cohesion policy governance model. Do we have already regionalized delivery, or is it all centralized? What is the mix between thematic, regional, multi-fund programs? Integrated territorial investments, ITI, have integrated in the name. So if you already have an integration within a multi-fund program, maybe you don't feel the need so much to have these. Maybe, or maybe you do. Administrative capacities, we often come back to that, and very much it's about the perceived capacities. So therefore, the willingness of higher levels to devolve some of these tasks to lower levels. Is there enough trust? And also the importance and scale of EU funding. So many countries, we have very little cohesion policy funding. There's high thematic concentration requirements. And if you then deduct all this, you end up with a very thin slice of the cake, which then may be not worth cutting it further up into, let's say, 50 local action groups for CLD. Maybe it's not worth the effort to do so. So there might be not much added value in creating additional systems. And finally, are there maybe already existing development frameworks, particularly in Western, Northern Europe, where you have domestic systems that have been in place for decades, doing similar things, and there's not really that much innovation, not much added value perceived to come from taking on new models. Looking ahead from what we see, we don't know much, but what we can say is, that many countries have reasonably strong implementation systems established. There has been critique in the first of the period in 1420 that things took quite a long time to be implemented. Absorption was quite low at the start, but now we're in the second program period. There is the experience, there are established systems. There is not a need to build strategies from scratch in these various various territories. So I could mention the Czech case, for instance, or the Portuguese case, where we have strong systems and actors and agencies in place that, for me, as what Serafin said, make it to imagine very difficult to abolish these completely. There's an overall debate on the degree of centralization we might need again in cohesion policy, or do we want to decentralize? And Serafin also mentioned the RRF as an example that people look at because of its perceived simpler implementation model. And the single plans that we will heard of and are likely to come, what territorial dimension can we expect in those? So far, we can only guess, and we can look at the EU's road to the next MFF. And if you read that, there is very little mention of anything regional or subnational, but there is at least, this is the part here on the slide in italics, that territorial cohesion is mentioned together with economic and social cohesion, and that this policy should be designed and implemented with the regions in its center, and finally it says with national, regional and local authorities. This sounds all very good, and what this really means in practice remains quite open. So I would say there's still hope, so that there will be a strong territorial dimension in these policies within this single plan, but what it will look like, we don't know yet. And that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. And Ursula, you are going to wrap up?
Okay. Right. So the last point I want to bring up to this puzzle is the rural angle. But maybe before, I'm not sure if any of us have actually said that before. Keeping in mind that this event is actually happening at the time when very little is known. And therefore, we need another discussion. So we have actually planned a follow-up of this on this event. So don't be discouraged by the fact that we always say now we don't know very much. We cannot have. It's very difficult to have a meaningful discussion. We still think it's possible to have a meaningful discussion, but it's true we may need another go at that discussion, and that's what we're going to do later this year, probably in May. So that's maybe something to keep in mind as well. I don't know, maybe. Okay, so for me, then the rural side, as Joanna explained, my background goes back a long while in rural development. This is just a reminder, the same picture I showed at the beginning, but just to give you a little bit more of the rural side here and the non-urban side here. So what is actually fund? What does the EU fund in rural development? So we have the European Agriculture Fund for Rural Development, and note the A here, which says agriculture. So there's very clear in the minds of EU legislators, there's a still very clear link of rural development with agriculture, which is questionable, but this is how the situation is. So the local development of this fund is currently 7.7%. So from the funding period that we have now. Just as a reminder, because as also Stefan was talking about mandatory allocations, in the European Agriculture Fund for Rural Development, there is a mandatory allocation for the local tool, which is LEADER, of 5%. We are higher than the mandatory 5%, but not very much higher. Then in cohesion policy, there is a significant amount of funding that is also targeting rural areas, but, and here you have my picture, nobody knows how much exactly. It's very difficult because, as you saw before, very often the territorial tools in cohesion policy are divided between urban and non-urban. We're not quite clear whether everything that is non-urban is automatically rural, but also it's very for example, the social fund, European Social Fund, is not tagged at all as where the intervention is taking place. So we don't know how much of this money is going to rural areas. We do know something, but not a lot. And then the knowledge at the EU level about the national funding schemes is even less present. Of course, at the national level, managing authorities know where the money is going, but that's very difficult to integrate at the EU level. So this is the situation we have today. What is the questions that rural stakeholders, rural communities are struggling with to look into the future, to ask themselves how the future might look like, is, okay, first of all, what is the place for rural development in the sense of how will it be linked with other policies? Will it still be linked with agriculture, as the European Agriculture Fund for Rural Development seems to indicate, or will it be closely linked with other tools or with cohesion policy? Will there be maybe a separate tool specifically targeting rural areas? The second question is how much money? So one thing is where the money will be actually managed, how it will be managed, but the second thing is how much of it will be. And there is a very big debate, because currently rural development is a small percentage of all agriculture funding. It used to be 10%, but I think currently it could be even less than that. There is an indefinite amount of funding from cohesion policy. How much of that is actually going to continue to go to rural areas, especially if, as Serafin also said, the cohesion policy funding might not be maintained at the same amount as now. Then, of course, how much of overall rural development will be delivered through local tools? So what we as LDnet are particularly interested in is how much local development will be happening in rural areas. So the proportion, is it still the 5% officially mandatory required, or another proportion? Whether will there be any proportion? Will there be any minimum required? And I just to mention my own reflection is where managing authorities say we don't want any minimum, we don't want any ring fencing, we just want to decide ourselves how much we're going to allocate to rural areas. That, in a sense, means that the European level is abdicating and is allowing the countries that are already doing well and managing their funds well to continue doing well, but it's not supporting the countries that might not be doing so well and might need some kind of incentive from the EU level to improve their policies. So there is always a big question mark about, do we need the ring fencing? Do we need the minimum, the minima, and so on? And then with all that, we want to know how much will the local communities be able to have a say about how the money is spent. Because it's one thing how much money will actually go through the local tool, whether it's a CLLD or ITI. And another question is how much the communities will actually be able to influence that. Will there be scope for local decision making? I will look at these questions in a moment, but I would just want to bring some more considerations. So one thing that has become more and more realized by everybody is that rural areas are not just important for the rural inhabitants, but they are important for the whole society. Rural areas are a European value. They are foundation of European identity. Therefore, it is not surprising that rural inhabitants are expecting to continue to be supported from the overall funding. There's not just there's no justification for them to continue to be marginalized or deprived for funding. Then EU level support has to bring something new in addition to what the national and regional level is doing. So there's no point by EU level to do the same things that national authorities are doing. That's what I mentioned earlier. The EU has to provide incentives to do other things, to do more, to do something which brings this famous European added value. So the value added of leader approach of CLLD, there has been progress in, as I think Serafin mentioned, that it's not easy to measure what the added value is of applying the local tools, but there has been major studies and major guidance how to measure that. So hopefully in the future we will have better data to prove that local development actually works. And also the fact that there will be less money will also mean that we need better coordination, better synergy. So there's all the more emphasis on coordinating the different policies, making sure that there's no duplication and that there is good coherence. And the other consideration which emphasizes the importance of local development approaches is that there's no one-size-fits-all solutions. the rural areas are very diverse. So trying to design rural support or rural policies from Brussels or from national capitals is not going to work, because there needs to be different solutions adapted to the specific rural areas. Now, going back, and the importance of stakeholder involvement, that I think there's work done by OECD, but there's generally rural stakeholders. If they are not involved in deciding how their policies are applied at the local level, the policies are probably not going to work. So even the small amount of funding that will still be available to them will not be spent in the best way. So going back to my earlier questions, so the place for rural development, is it agriculture or cohesion? Under which Directorate General it will be managed? So what the government's model? Will there be a dedicated fund for rural development? This is what a lot of rural stakeholders are advocating, for example, that there has to be a special, if not a fund, at least a special strategy which would draw funding from different sources of funds, but something dedicated, specifically focusing on rural areas. That there are all these questions which don't have an answer yet for the future. The question for the amount of funding, well, we have said that there are a lot of new priorities and new urgent things that the European money has to be spent on, but we still need to safeguard sufficient funding. So we have trade-offs: sufficient funding for rural areas and for local development in rural areas. Some questions is, do you allocate based on per capita, which means, of course, with fewer inhabitants, rural areas are always going to lose. Or is the allocation going to be based on the actual needs and development gaps, and where do you actually put the balance? The mandatory minimum, as I mentioned before, do we leave it up to the member state to decide how much, or do we have something at the EU level? I have the feeling that the European level is more and more reluctant. The European Commission is more and more reluctant to set those mandatory minima. But I think that there's a big risk. And then the issue of monitoring where the funding is actually going. So it's one thing to allocate the funding up front, and then monitoring where the money is spent, and that we still have a long way to go to know how much money is actually being spent. The local development tools now, that. Do we have ring fencing? Do we still have minimum for CLLD? Do you have one tool or more? CLLD and ITI are vastly different, and the degree of local autonomy is very different. Do we try to have an integrated one local tool or more? What are the incentives for uptake? There was an incentive in 2014 to 2020 that if a member state decided to use some funding through local development, it would get an extra percentage of less national co-financing, in other words. And then scope for local decision making. How do you safeguard local autonomy? Community-led aspect of avoiding gold plating, making too many rules. Member states tend to make additional rules on top of what's required at the EU level, and that takes away from the local communities the possibility to decide how they want to spend the money. And then, of course, there's a question of building the capacity at local and main levels. These are all the questions. We don't have the answers yet. So I just wanted to bring them to the picture to hopefully stimulate some discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ursula. And it was always going to be a big ask to be able to cram so much information into quite a short period of time. But it's important, as Ursula said, to start the discussion. So is there anybody who would like to actually ask a question now of the panelists, of our experts, or raise a question for general discussion? I see in the chat there is Richard Tufts has made a statement about the key question is what policies, instruments go into competitive fund and what goes into cohesion. So the cohesion policy might become a form of poor law, or social security for less developed regions. So how do you feel about on that? Have you any comments to make on that?
I'll have a try with a question if you want. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go for it. Yes.
No, just to Serafin, basically. Well, to all of you, thank you very much, because I thought they were very clear and extremely useful presentations. But to Serafin, is the gist of what you're saying that basically the Commission's proposals now may be not so bad as long as there is a regionalization of them and some sort of safeguard for the territorial elements. And linked to that, I think there's a real question of strategy now. I mean, because there's been a lot of opposition to those Commission proposals from the agricultural lobby and from regional lobby as well. Is the best strategy to try and carve out something for local within those EU proposals, or to go against those proposals? So those are two questions, if you like.
If I may, very quickly, this debate about whether this is a positive or bad thing is very much depends on background conditions. So very much is like when you look at the implementation of partnership principles, background conditions is what's the primary explanatory variable, meaning that partnership principle exists in Denmark and the Netherlands, and you don't need European regulation or code of conduct for that. So this is the same. The Netherlands, Finland, Denmark, no problem. They can live with this structure. It's absolutely no problem. Why? Because the software of the country, the whole governance of the country is done that way. Whereas in other countries, if there's not a clear governance requirements from the European level, you end up having to the discretion of the country. And look, as I said earlier, Spain has a very regionalized structure for cohesion policy and has a much more than most countries regionalized structure of reconciliation facility for political more than legal reasons. Germany and Austria, you see that in the CAP strategic plans. You see that even more in the case of the reconciliation national plans on reconciliation national plans, the ERRF national plans, a much more centralized approach. And that is worrying, because that will be, I would argue modestly, even unconstitutional in German or Austrian constitutional law. And that still that happens. So that much worries me, that unless there's clear minimum, maybe not very detailed, but very strong and clear governance points, markers from the European regulations, we leave far too many things to the discretion of not just the country, but the government of the day. Having said that, as regards to local, I think since that the IAGRI managed to come up with 8% of CAP being spent on non-agricultural local development, and that regional, cohesion policy, ERDF, is 8% as well. Actually, some countries like Germany, 10%. I think the case for the campaigners, I don't know, small idea, 8% for everybody. So every national plan must have 8%. This is something that is backed with data, and therefore it's easy to campaign for. Small advice from a territorial lobbyist from my previous life. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter, I know that you've got your hand up, but I think because you can wrap up anyway, we'll give the floor to Enrica next.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I don't put my camera. I just want to share a reflection. It has been published by the Commission that the money coming for local development or rural development from the CAP is not enough, and there is need for other funds, other departments, other DGs, other ministries to start engaging with rural development. And also another interesting outcome is there is a need to strengthen and reinforce the bottom-up approach for rural development, but there is also a big need for big investment in rural area. In other words, we need CLLD is a must, but we also but it's not enough. And so a question that comes to my mind is, with this new approach of the one fund, etc., what are the options that we have to ensure that rural territories are evenly covered to cover their needs? We have been talking about ring fencing. If I understand, normally ring fencing, what we think is more to make sure that we have the bottom-up, the participatory approach, integrated approach. But how do we ensure as well that this ring fencing, I don't know if ring fencing might be the right one. How do we ensure that we have sufficient money from the other funds to cover for things that LDnet cannot cover, or CLLD and ITI cannot cover? Is it ring fencing the solution? Do we have can we think of other mechanisms to point out to the lack of support in these areas? For me, it's an important question for which I don't have an answer. So I think debate is very, very important there.
So does anybody have any quick reply to that? I think to some degree there may be that some of these questions we actually put to the next webinar, because let's have these things as an ongoing discussion. But if there are any particular answers, I mean, Peter, you put your finger up. I presume you have a reply to that.
My original hand was to help you with the Q&A, but this one is a specific thing. I think when we look in the past, whenever you see these sort of consolidations of funds into sort of one fund to combat them all, and some of the points in the chat, including from Richard, saying that the emphasis on competitiveness tends to favour more favoured areas, and also when you see how, so there have been a number of experiences of putting funds together and trying to reduce the number of programs, the elimination of the community initiatives back in about 2006. What we generally and the UK had quite a lot of experiences with trying to combine different funding streams and then giving regional development agencies a single pot. This was done 2 or 3 times with a single regeneration budget. What seems to me to happen is that the territorial granularity decreases, and member states tend to try and spread the money more evenly rather than dedicating it to areas in the greatest need. So especially in relation to cohesion policy, how this will then link to the definition of objective areas, more developed, less developed, and so on, the allocation of funds between them, the more that this is handed down in a sense to the member state level, the less regionalisation you tend to end up with, and the more and from our point of view at LDnet particularly, the less there will end up in local development pockets. So I think that's a sort of general conclusion that we should be a little bit anxious, to say the least, about how these reforms will impact the sort of policies that we've been curating over these years. I'll stop there.
Okay, is it Martin? Is that would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I'll be short, and I just would like to thank you very much for organizing this webinar. I've been in this community for quite long. Then I drifted a bit north and a bit less urban. I come from an urban background. Have been working in the Commission on Niger-Regio on actually the territorial tools and doing reports with actually John Beckler's team earlier. Now I work with the EA and Norway grants at EFTA for the last 6 years. And actually I joined because of local development, because we mainly have program areas that are sectoral, but we have one for local development. And I always ask myself, what is that for? What is the purpose? And a bit listening to the presentations, this provocative question came to me, like, what is, how do we define the aim of having local development perspective in cohesion policy? What is the objective we are trying to achieve here? I mean, all of us know how the geopolitical shifts and the new MFF proposal will be much more focused on defense, security, everything, and Ms. von der Leyen's aim to make policies more able to deliver. But what are we trying to deliver with local development, be that urban, coastal, or rural? Because we see that a lot of areas are depopulating and there are increasing territorial disparities within countries rather than between the member states. So I just wanted to clarify one thing, because I also was part of the 2021-27 preparation at Eurocities, lobbying the Commission and the Parliament and the Council. And I always had to explain that the earmarking for urban was not about giving extra money for urban areas. I mean, they receive 50-60% of the cohesion policy anyway. The point was, on one hand, to provide a tool to go beyond this, to go across the silos that are marked by the different funds that we have. Secondly, to give a local say in what's happening, but most importantly, to improve governance, to improve local governance, and actually apply that same partnership principle locally, so that the mayor asks the people, academia, and the businesses in cities to build a strategy together. So it was actually meant to help improve a more strategic approach to local governance and a more participative approach to local governance. And that's what was supposed to be encouraged or initiated by the earmarked funding through the urban earmarking in the RDF. And I don't know to what extent this happened. I mean, we've had the evaluations and studies, and I can't agree more with Serafin that basically if a country works like that, it's going to work like that with all the funds. And if it doesn't, it might just become a bit of a window dressing. So to conclude, my question is a bit same as one in the chat, that if we don't have a more pronounced objective of why we are having this local development or territorial aspect of the policies in the first place, then cohesion policy might risk becoming just a pot for the poor, or like just the price to buy cohesion from the broader groups of the population, and just fight off populism and anti-EU sentiment. And I'm looking forward to the second edition of this webinar, because I know we're running out of time. Thank you.
We are indeed. Ursula, you have a reply?
Well, I wouldn't probably be able to reply fully, because that would take a long time. But I do apologize, because when we designed this event, actually, it should have been somewhere, probably in my presentation, that there were some elements about explaining what we mean when we talk about local development. It's not just something that happens at the local level. It's much more. It's especially when we talk about community-led local development, it's a very, very clearly defined methodology, which is strictly making sure that the power actually is given to the local people and the local community. And that involves creating a local partnership, developing a strategy, making sure that the whole area is looked at in a holistic way, rather than in silos, sector by sector. That's a whole range of things. And as I mentioned before, the reasoning, some of the arguments that I mentioned, that the diversity of rural areas, in case of rural areas, but it applies equally to urban areas, that you cannot design policies at the capital level, and not even at the regional level. So you really have to adapt to the specific challenges, specific opportunities of a given area. That's what the local people can do better than politicians at the decision-making level. So the diversity, the involvement of the local people, and the value added that they bring by their voluntary contributions and engagement and so on. So all these things that make up these local development approaches that we're talking about is not just anything happening locally. But I would just also echo what you said earlier when you were working with Eurocities. You have also realized that it's not only how much money is spent, but also how this money is spent. The local development is a method. It's not what you spent the money for, but how you spend it. And that's what makes the difference.
Thank you, Ursula. And Stefan?
I know we're late, but it's great. Good point, Martin, also to put a face to the name, because we've been using some of your materials that you produced while you were at the Commission. There's a diagram that still is floating about because it's very good. We did this ex-post evaluation of territorial instruments, and we hope to be able to give some answers to your question. We have submitted the final report. We're waiting for comments, and everything has been a bit delayed, but hopefully we can soon share this. And you gave some of the answers yourself, is the governance aspect. So is this idea not so how much money, but how? So do we have, is this a way of improving capacities, devolving tasks, and creating capacities to take action into their own hand and create these both in urban and rural areas? And we tried to define pathways, as we call them, and hopefully we can share this soon, and really look at what is the added value to have an answer. So what's the whole point in going through this? Because we can see, oh, it delayed spending, and maybe increase the risk of errors and so on. But why do we actually do this? And I think we tried to give some answers, and we can see, and you might remember the map of 1420, where we see a bit of a pattern. And I think it's easiest to implement in those countries where there is experience, as the ones that have been mentioned before, where there has already a policy making that is participatory and very localized. But it has the biggest impact, we found, in those countries where this maybe was not the case. And some countries used this opportunity that was offered by the Commission and developed a wide-ranging system, made use of a lot of funding, and went really far in this. And I mentioned the Czech case before. I can also mention maybe Croatia. There are a number of countries, Slovenia, who really did quite a lot. And I think there we can see added value, more than so in others. But that's hopefully soon we can share more of the findings. That's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. Well, obviously, as everybody's been saying, time has run on, and we will have to draw this to a close. But I think what this has really done is initiated some very good discussions that have potential to be taking a little bit wider. So this is the first of our webinars on this particular topic. It will not be the last. So we'll have to think about how we actually incorporate some of the comments in the chat into a future webinar, and also, you know, how do we take this forward? How do we encourage this discussion? How do we get involved? I think that is probably one of the biggest takeaways, that, you know, we have to get involved if we're going to have a future that Europe that we want, and not one that is taken or stolen from us, as we've seen in other places. So on that note, I'm going to draw this to a close. So it is not finished yet.
Sorry, but just one tiny point. I see in the chat somebody has asked a very relevant question about the candidate countries. The countries which are not currently members of the EU. And we as LDnet, we don't limit our activities just to the European Union member states. So we are much more interested about Europe as a continent. But frankly, I have to say, I don't think anybody here knows anything about that, except that the security topic will definitely be definitely a prominent aspect of the next funding period. I don't know if anybody else can say something more.
No, anyone? Peter?
But I also wouldn't say I'm an expert, although I've occasionally worked with the Eastern Partnership countries. My guess is that there will be concern around them, but the pathway towards membership is so long, and the question will be how much resource can be allocated, given the problems of growth within the EU and the lack of the other competing forces for the cake. So I think that's where we're at, really. But it's very clear that the security issue is obviously rising up the agenda very rapidly and possibly catastrophically. Back to you, Joanna.
Thank you for that very positive note. But yeah, this does show why it's a very crucial and critical conversations that we need to have. That resilience, as somebody in the chat actually mentioned, is quite fundamental within rural areas, as they are closer to the European borders, European Union borders. So these are things that we need to obviously discuss and take forward. And we will bear these in mind, and we will have another webinar at a later date, and we'll send out to people who are here. So we're going to wrap this bit up, but we are going to move into our General Assembly very soon, of which we would warmly welcome you to stay on. But we also recognise that we probably need about 5 minutes to get up and move about and have a little bit of a break. Peter, is there anything you'd like to say just to concluding remarks? As our president, sorry, I haven't said that.
Well, just an advert for the association, really, that we are making this move, which the General Assembly will be ratifying, to re-register in Estonia, which gives us more flexibility and more potential for the future. I'd encourage anyone to join the association for the future. We're going to try and have a more active agenda this year than we had last year. And just as a final plug, the membership for the first year will be free, and then there will be a modest charge for future years. So do please consider joining us, even if you decide not to join, stay in touch and consider joining future webinars and other activities of the association. I think that's all I'd like to say about this. I think to conclude on the content of the workshop, I can't really add anything beyond what our excellent speakers have already said, and I'd just like to thank them very warmly for their contributions, which have helped to both educate us and inform us. Thank you very much.